He loses his temper with them, with the rock and the water, and maybe he needed to be more patient with them because they're not his parents' generation that have sinned and fetched for 40 years. This is a new generation, and he's not attuned to that. He's part of the older generation. There's something incompatible with him and the leadership that is demanded at that time. And in fact, there are many commentators that look at this whole idea of what was the problem? Why was it that Moses could not go into the land of Israel? And if we go back to this verse that he says, and God was angry at me for your sake. There are many commentaries that say that for your sake means that it was for the sake of the nation that Moses couldn't go in. And there's two ways of looking at this. It could be because his leadership qualities are declining and he's not appropriate for this generation, okay? And therefore, for the sake of the nation, they need another leader, okay? There's another approach that says that actually the relationship between God and the nation of Israel during the whole time in the desert, as represented by the relationship between God and Moses, is a relationship that is based on the supernatural more than anything else. They exist in a desert, no food and no water. God brings water from rocks, and he brings food from the heavens. And what does the scripture say? They didn't have to change their clothes because their clothes didn't wear out, and they didn't have to change their shoes because the shoes didn't wear out. That is not normal, okay? The existence of the nation of Israel in the desert for 40 years is a supernatural existence. And Moses was the leader for that. Because Moses what does God say? Only Moses spoke face to face with me. That's not a normal human being. Moses is way up there, okay? So Moses, in his relationship with God, he was the right leader for a supernatural existence. But when you're going into the land of Israel, you need Joshua. Don't forget, what's Joshua? Joshua is a general. He's a righteous man, but he's a general. It's going to be a whole different reality. So we have two different ways of looking at the fact that this would be for the nation's sake. I think also if you look at the sin, this occurred to me like a few days ago. Where does in Deuteronomy at the end of chapter 3, Deuteronomy 3, the last sentence, and we were sitting in the valley opposite the house of Peor, as if it hinting to that terrible sin of Peor with sending those prostitutes, etc. And it occurred to me that maybe that sentence is a hint to the disastrous consequences of, at this stage of the game, having such an intimate relationship with God and that kind of a leadership. When they sin with idolatry, and immediately 24,000 people are killed. Now, let's go into the land of Israel. The nation goes into the land of Israel. Do you know how many times, you've read Judges. Joshua, the book of Joshua, that's 20 years approximately, and they're pretty good in that book, okay? Then you read the Judges, and you read Samuel, and you read Kings. Do you know how many times the nation sins with idolatry? Can you imagine if every time the nation sinned with idolatry, God would be sending plagues and tens of thousands would be killed at once? Would there be a nation of Israel left? There's something about coming to the land of Israel, and if we're going to stay and they're going to last a while there, requires perhaps God to be a little bit more removed from the nation. This might be a hard concept to grasp, but I liken it to the relationship with the Holy of Holies, okay? The high priest is the only one who can go into the Holy of Holies only one day a year, and it's an extremely dangerous thing. What happens when Aaron's sons went into the Holy of Holies, okay? They're immediately killed. And it's not even clear what they did wrong. They brought the extra incense. I mean, it's not even clear what happened there. But there's something there that, and what does God say to Aaron? He says, I become holy through those closest to me. There's something there about too much intimacy with God for people who are not on that level, burns, destroys. Okay? And there's a realization here as the nation is about to enter the land of Israel. We're going from the miraculous to the ordinary. You can't have a Moses-God kind of relationship in that thing. Everything will burn. It's too intense. It's too intense, this kind of relationship. We are moving from a Moses leadership to a Joshua leadership. Our sages say Moses is like the sun and Joshua is the moon. Okay, and that's also interesting because that brings me one of the interpretations of what Moses is actually asking for here in Deuteronomy is that he's asking for not to lead the nation into the land, but just let him go in as a normal citizen. Okay, Moses can't go in as a normal citizen because if Joshua is the moon, what happens in the daylight? When the moon is always there, by the way, but do you see the moon in the daylight? No, why? Because the sun gets in the way. Okay? Moses can't go in alongside Joshua because Joshua's leadership will be completely eclipsed. It cannot happen. And you have that, I don't know, I was just talking to someone the other day who was telling me, a pastor, who was telling me in their denomination, the rule is when the pastor retires, he must leave the church. He cannot remain as a member, exactly for this reason. You know, you need to make sure you know who your leader is and not have somebody on the sidelines who's a competing thing. Okay, now, so basically, I want to also, though, go back to the two Midrash stories that I started with, okay? Because the two Midrash stories are saying two different but also similar things. I think in both cases, there's an admission that it is not necessarily logical. There's no logical reason presented in the Midrash for why Moses couldn't go in. There's a difference, though, in how that situation is accepted. In the first story, Moses is angry, and he's railing against that reality. And that would correspond to an understanding of Numbers 27 together with what we know from Deuteronomy 3, that it's a product of an angry exchange, okay? That is essentially the way I look at the Midrash. What's the Midrash doing? It's basically doing what I just did. It's taking Deuteronomy 3, sticking it into Numbers 27, and suddenly seeing this conversation as an angry exchange between God and Moses, and the Midrash is fleshing out what is that angry exchange. And the angry exchange is basically Moses saying, this is not just. This is not fair. And there's no answer to it. That's Moses, God says, this is how it is, and Moses ends with, this is not just, and that's the end of the story. The second story has Moses saying, I don't deserve it, but please give it to me, and God says no, okay? Now, we don't have a reason in the second story why God says no, but what we have in the second story is an acceptance by Moses. It's essentially saying, I don't know why. I don't know why you said no. I don't know why you say yes. Because actually, I didn't go into the detail of the second Midrash, but the second Midrash actually goes further, and it says, God basically says to man, I don't owe man anything. If you do good, that's all very nice, but that doesn't mean I owe you something. If I give you something, I'm being nice, but I don't owe it to you. And so this is Moses. Then the understanding of the second Midrash is that Moses is saying this doesn't make sense in the world of reward and punishment. I did good, I should be rewarded. The difference is that Moses is saying in the second Midrash, I accept that I don't understand how God works. I accept that I may do things and I think maybe I deserve or do bad things, but we can't understand God's ways. He is way above us, and therefore I come with humility to God and I say, God, just give me a freebie. And so the difference here is not in how we understand why God didn't let Moses go in. The difference is how Moses accepted God's decision. In the first midrash, he rails against it. In the second midrash, he accepts it. And I think that these two midrashim actually refer to the two different ways you can read the story. In Numbers 27, there's more of an angry exchange, especially if we take the extra information we have from Deuteronomy 3. In Deuteronomy 3, it's very calm. It's very accepting. Moses says, I pleaded, God didn't accept, and then what does Moses say? God was angry at me for your sake. So then in Deuteronomy, Moses expresses the fact that he understands that in the end of the day, he can't go in for the sake of the nation. Is it just for him? Maybe not. But it's what needs to happen for the sake of the nation. He accepts the situation, and this is how it has to be. So that's a very long study. But I draw something from this in terms of how I see our relationship to the land of Israel, and especially if I go back to this notion of a Moses kind of leadership on the one hand, and another kind of leadership that is necessary for the nation as they go into the land. And I think this is something that I think teaches us a great deal as we deal with the land of Israel today. I don't know if you're aware, but and I wonder if there wasn't a similar kind of discussion or debate within Christianity in response to the land of Israel, the state of Israel, in the same way there was in Jewish circles. And when Zionism began in the middle of the 19th century, there were many rabbis, particularly in Europe, who were against Zionism for a very simple reason. They said, the return to the land is supposed to happen in a miraculous way. It needs to be as a result of Messiah. And until Messiah comes on his white donkey and blowing his shofar, we're not going anywhere. Now, most of those rabbis ended up perishing in the Holocaust, and that certainly changed the way a lot of people saw things. But that was the original understanding. And then came the Zionists, who, for the most part, certainly in that time, were secular. They weren't even taking God into account. They were saying, God's not, we got to do this for ourselves. Jews are being persecuted in Israel. There's, terrible things going on. We have an opportunity that we've read the political situation, and there's an opportunity to do something. We have to do something. Now, a religious Zionist, and there were religious Zionists in those years, there were rabbis who did agree with the Zionists that we have to take initiatives. We don't have to wait for Messiah. Not because they didn't believe Messiah was coming, which is what the seculars believed, but they understood that there's an element of coming into the land of Israel that has to be based on the natural, that has to be based on human endeavor. And I think that if we go and we look at how the nation of Israel entered the land under Joshua, and I say this a lot to people, but it's suddenly I'm putting it together in the context of what we talked about tonight. If I read like Ezekiel 36, speaks to the mountains of Israel. It's one of the most beautiful chapters of redemption and return, restoration of Israel. Okay, what does God say? God said that He's going to the trees will shoot forth their branches, the cities will be rebuilt, the mountains will once again be resettled by human beings. Okay, it's a beautiful, beautiful picture of a restored land and people of Israel on the mountains of Israel. Okay. How is that going to happen? Now, based on that children of Israel existence in the desert, the way the food came from the heaven, you would say, okay, the houses come from the heaven. The trees come from the heaven. The people are sitting somewhere, I don't know, God says, beam them up, Scotty, like in Star Trek, right? And you end up in Israel. Okay. But when Joshua entered the land of Israel, there were no beam you up anybody's. Okay? The land became part of Israel because they went to war. And God did miracles. And in fact, it's a very interesting progression. If you read the book of Joshua, there is a progression from miracles that accompany the wars. Well, actually, Jericho is incredibly miraculous. But as the book progresses, there are fewer and fewer miracles and more battles, more and more politics, more and more ordinary human endeavor, because that's the transition from the Moses to the Joshua that we see played out before us in the book of Joshua. In our lifetime and today, I don't believe God is saying to us, sit back and wait for the events to unfold. Messiah is going to drop houses from the heavens. Are we hoping that one day we will be at that level of intimacy with God, that we will have a Moses or a Messiah, or that we'll have a temple? Of course. That is what we are aiming for. But we're not there yet. We're certainly not ready for that yet. That level of intimacies. You have so many people in Israel that don't even know if they believe in God or if they believe in God. You know, that we're in a secular world. But again, if I go back and I take both the Joshua experience and I take Ezekiel 36, the only way to get started on this redemption business is to build the land and to go to the land in a physical way. And that doesn't mean railing against God. On the contrary, it means working with God. Because every single thing that we've witnessed in the rebirth and restoration of Israel has been miraculous. But not miraculous because we sat on our couch and we watched God wave some kind of wand. Miraculous because we were completely outnumbered in 1948. And we were still able to fight. We did what we could. We didn't have good weapons. We didn't have good planes. We did what we could, and God came and blessed our efforts. And that's the pattern. I see this coming back now to the land of Israel. It's got to be a physical coming back. And I say this, by the way, and dispute things I've heard, not so much by Israel supporters. You don't hear it there. But I know there are whisperings in the church of different types of Christians. So when they look at Israel, they're saying, what do they say about a redemption? They say it's a spiritual Israel. They'll say it's not in the ground. It's not on the earth. That is not true. The restoration of Israel is first and foremost physical, accompanied by spiritual underpinnings. And of course, we hope that we will get to a point and Messiah will come. And Jews and Christians both believe in Messiah with different visions of who and when and all that. But we don't have to go into that. But we believe that we're going to go to a more spiritual type of plane, but it has to be rooted in the physical. So that's what I wanted to share with you today from the Torah portion. And I do want to share a bit about our work, but before I do that, if any of you have any questions or any comments or challenges based upon the teaching I've done so far, this is your chance.
Can
yes.
we first thank you for that lesson?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Yes.
I just really appreciate you sharing the midrash, if I'm saying that correctly.
You are.
Because as I learned to have my own walk with God, I can imagine that Moses could have very easily had both of those reactions that were shared, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we'd start out being angry and saying that it's unfair, and then saying, oh, but I'm not God. And I can now see that if your answer is no. And so I just don't know if that's something from a Jewish point of view that you
100%, yeah. And with Jewish point of view, very often you have multiple approaches in a midrash. And in a Jewish point of view, you can kind of carry all those multiple approaches at once. And you can say that there's disagreement. But I think there's elements of truth in all of them that you can also synthesize. And I think you've done that beautifully by saying, there's a, but I think, I personally, like I said, I think the fact that the Midrash gives us the freedom to rail against God. And I think too often people believe that that there isn't that space in our relationship with God. The key, though, is to come to the second Midrash, like you're saying, where at some point you say, look, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. But at the end of the day, you're bigger. We have to submit and just say, okay, just give it to me for free then. I can't say I deserve it, but a freebie, and that's a whole different approach. Yeah. Yes?
Is the Midrash and the Jewish pseudegraphica
pseudographia are Second Temple writings. That's different. Which are not only Jewish. I mean, like, are you referring to like the Book of Jubilee and Ben Sira and those things? I think that's what's usually known. Apocrypha and the pseudographia, those are two types of writings that precede the Midrash. At least their recording is earlier than the Midrash. They are from the Second Temple period, and they're written by Jews, and many of them have been incorporated into a Catholic Bible, like the Apocryphas in the Catholic Bible. And over the years, there was, Jews didn't really know about them that much, and they rediscovered them only in modern times, but they are considered today to be Jewish books that were preserved in the Greek, not in the Jewish, but that they were originally written probably in Hebrew and at some or in Aramaic, and got translated at some point to Greek. But those are earlier. But they're in many ways similar to the Midrash because they're also very story-based. But some of them, or a lot of them, are considered to be the product of cults that were very common in the Second Temple period, separating from what would have been normative Judaism. Like if you know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to be probably the product of the Essene cult that got really involved in the forces of darkness and evil and purity and all that kind of stuff. And it was like they took certain Jewish ideas and then took them to an extreme and were no longer part of the mainstream. And so some of these books would come from that. That's not what the Midrash is. The Midrash is recorded later, but reflects traditions that would have been, hanging around orally earlier, that would be more closely associated with the Pharisees during the Second Temple period. If that makes sense. Yeah.
So I have the perception that the Jewish people have great respect for Moses. Just, what a leader. What, his intimacy with God, his life, and it's just so highly respected. This particular lesson today gets to an aspect of Moses where perhaps he wasn't just completely polished off and perfect. I'm wondering if the telling of this story, and I know that you will tell it, you will tell it like you read it, and call it like you see it. My real question is, are you a teacher who's willing to kind of give this kind of story, and would there be other rabbis and so forth that just wouldn't quite go there because they wouldn't want to take any chance of tarnishing a great man, truly a great man?
Okay, first of all, I love this question because what you have just did is put your finger on the pulse of something that was a raging debate within Orthodox Judaism in Israel, like in the past decade. Okay, this is it. Okay, so I study, and my rabbis are part of a tradition that would be very comfortable with this kind of analysis. This is the people that I've been studying with. And it's very important to say we are not ripping Moses apart. We feel very strongly that he was an amazing man, as close to God as man ever got. Okay, we say, there's a prayer that we say regularly that says there was never someone like Moses. Okay, has never been since someone like Moses, that kind of prophet, that kind of person that was so close to God. So we believe that, and I believe that. But on the other hand, I'm reading a midrash that I didn't write. Right? This midrash is probably, at least in terms of from when it was recorded, it's at least 1,500 years old. Okay, and the people who wrote it, these are very acceptable traditional sources. But at the same time, so I don't know. I think the midrash was doing exactly what I'm doing now. But over the years, I don't know. The raging debate was: can we look at figures in the Bible and bring them down and to human proportions and exercise character analysis, for example, when we discuss these images? So there are people who say, no, you can't do that because they're if they're in the Bible, they're like God-like. And for example, there's this is a classic. There's a debate in the Talmud. So this debate didn't start now. This goes back to the Talmud. Okay, in the Talmud, there's a debate where there are two different sages, and one that says, with reference to David and Bathsheba and that terrible sin. Okay, one says anyone who says that David sinned in that case is a sinner themselves. And another one said, anyone who says he didn't sin, is a sinner themselves. Okay? So there you have it. Now, at the end, you have these people that say, no, he sinned, David. But was the sin quite as bad as it was? And maybe there were extenuating circumstances. Okay, that becomes it. So, but what that comment says is, to what extent can we take a look at King David and look at him at eye level and say, this was wrong? Because if your neighbor did something like that, you would just say unabashedly, this was wrong. Or do you put these people on some pedestal and say, yes, clearly there's a problem here, but we can't judge them because they're up there somewhere, okay? So I'm coming from the school of, yes, we can evaluate these people. That doesn't mean we put ourselves at the same level of these people. I'm no King David. I am certainly no Moses. Okay, these people are somewhere up there. But they're not God.
They're human.
They're human. And human beings, no matter how great they are, sin, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. And that's just how I look at it.
Isn't that how we have hope?
I agree.
How would you have hope? You just say, okay, forget it. Well, I'm doomed.
Right, and to me, when I just go with the King David, one of the most powerful things about King David is that when Nathan comes to him and says, look what you have done, he says, I sinned. How many kings and queens of the world today, or presidents or prime ministers, have ever said, I sinned, I made a mistake, okay? And that's the greatness of David. Yes, he sinned because he's mortal, but he was able to recognize his sin, and he was able to write psalms about his sin, and that's how I look at it. But there are people who say, no, can't do that. But okay, for that reason, there's apples and oranges, and Anyway, so any other questions before we move on? Okay.
I just want to say you did a great job. You did exactly what I asked you in the letter. And I said, I want to know about this pleading.
Yeah.
And can we look at that we can plead like that? You can. Excellent.
Thank you. Wow, thank you so much.